From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Mark Immunation. I'm Chief of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division here at the Library of Congress. I'm just going to welcome you and introduce you to Sharon Horowitz, who's a Senior Reference Librarian over in the African Middle Eastern Division. Today we're having a talk by Dr. Jeremy Brown, which is one of those happy occasions where several divisions intersect in terms of their materials, in terms of their interests. And so we're able to have a program here in this room, use some of our books, use some of Ahmed's books, and have a really exciting talk ahead of us. Our colleagues next door are very important to us. We like to play well with others here in the Jefferson Building, and this is an example of doing that. So we're all very excited. We have the actual De Revolutionibus and a lovely Celerius Celestial Atlas out, as well as some examples of antiquarian Hebraica on the table. Those of you who come to these sessions will hear it once again. Those of you who are new, let me say, we'll be happy to show you anything you would like to see. I'll turn this over to Sharon, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon. On behalf of the Hebraic section, African and Middle Eastern Division, I'd like to add my greetings and thanks to you all for joining us here today. I also want to express my appreciation to Mark Immunation and the staff of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division for their assistance in putting this program together, for allowing some of their books to be displayed, and for their generosity in offering us this beautiful room for our joint program. Also, many thanks to my colleague in the Hebraic section, Anne Brenner, who made the lovely book labels and the brochures that are on the table that'll help you identify the relevant books that are being displayed here. One other piece of business, part of our mission is to publicize our collections, and one of the ways in which we do that is by having public programs such as this. The Hebraic section's next program will be on Tuesday, September 24th at noon in the African and Middle Eastern Reading Room. Poet Merrill Leffler will read from his new book entitled Mark the Music. We would love to see you all there. Today's speaker is Jeremy Brown, MD. He is Director of Emergency Care Research at the National Institutes of Health. He trained as an emergency physician in Boston, and prior to joining NIH, he worked in the Department of Emergency Medicine at George Washington University. In addition to his medical career, Dr. Brown has spent many years studying the relationship between science and Judaism. The fruit of which is the book he is speaking about today, New Heavens and a New Earth, the Jewish Reception of Copernican Thought. The books will be available for sale in the back after the lecture. Dr. Brown's book describes the long history of the varied Jewish responses to Copernicus's sun-centered system, where the moving earth was viewed by many, and even a few today, as conflicting with the tenets of the Jewish faith. Before I turn the podium over to Dr. Brown, I must mention that this event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast. There will be a formal question and answer period after the lecture, at which the audience is encouraged to ask questions and offer comments. Please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the Q&A period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jeremy Brown.
Good afternoon, everybody. And before I begin, I would like to point out that although I now have the privilege of working at the National Institutes of Health, I am here on my own time, and my remarks should not be understood as reflecting the official position of the National Institutes of Health or the government of the United States on the question of the Jewish reception of Copernican thought. All right, let's start with what we believed before the Copernican revolution. This illustration is from a work by Andreas Celerius called Atlas Celestis, a heavenly atlas published in Amsterdam in 1660. And the book is on display, like nearly all of the books that I'm going to talk about. The book is on display at the back. The book contains 29 double-page astronomical maps, of which this is one, and has been called the finest celestial atlas ever published. Cellarius, by the way, was a schoolmaster and teacher, and here he depicts the way we believe the universe was structured, which was a model of nested spheres with an unmoving Earth at its center. We owe this geocentric model of the universe to Aristotle and later to Ptolemy, who lived in Alexandria in the 2nd century of the Common Era. While the model did not originate with either of them, it has become synonymous with them, and so it is often called the Aristotelian or the Ptolemaic model of the universe. Surrounding the Earth was the Sun, the Moon, and the 5 known planets of the time: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter. In fact, Mercury was not known to be a separate planet then, which orbited the Earth in perfect circles, because a perfect circle was the most perfect of the geometric forms. Each planet was embedded in a clear crystalline sphere, and it was this sphere that revolved around the Earth, carrying the planet with it. Beyond the sphere lay the stars embedded in the outermost celestial sphere. It was the movement of this outermost sphere that caused all the other spheres to move at various speeds, taking the planet that was embedded with them. As illustrated by Cellarius, the spheres are nestled within each other like rings within an onion. This is what the Greeks believed. This is what the church believed. And this is what Jews believed. And this belief entered Jewish literature, where it remained untroubled and unchallenged until another book was published, the book that started it all. This book was called De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, or in English, On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. The book, which is on display here, is small and certainly not very pretty, but its importance lies in its content, not in its form. The library's first edition copy from 1543 on display here today has very interesting provenance. It was once owned by Sir Edward Sullivan, Lord Chancellor of Ireland, who died in 1886, and after his death it was sold at Sotheby's auction in London for the princely sum of £10 to an agent of Alfred T. White. White was a philanthropist, book collector, and trustee of the First Unitarian Church of Brooklyn, and on his death in 1921, his wife, Annie Jean, inherited the book. And Annie Jean sold the book to the Library of Congress in 1945 for $950. The library seems to have gotten a rather good deal. 5 years ago, a copy of this book was sold at Christie's auction house in New York for $2.2 million. Copernicus, born in 1473, came from a wealthy and well-connected family in what is now northwestern Poland. Through the intercession of his uncle, who was a bishop, Copernicus became a church official in the coastal town of Fromberg, where he made his observations that form the basis of his book. It was published very late in Copernicus's life, and in fact, he received a copy of the book, so the legend goes, on the very day that he died, May 24th, 1543. Here is what a page from that book looks like. And here, in detail, is a simple illustration from this most radical of books. In fact, this illustration is from the library's own copy. Mark Dimunation was generous enough to allow me to photograph it for my own book. Now, when I first asked him for permission, he replied, "Why? There are hundreds of images available online." There are thousands of images of Copernicus's book available online. And of course, he was totally correct. But I explained that my publisher needed an image free of any copyright issues, and this was the only way that I knew of getting such an image. Mark thought for a moment, we'd never met, and then he led me to the book, which I photographed under rather heavy guard, I might add. So Mark, I thank you in my book, and now I thank you again. Having thanked Mark Diminution, I want to pause and take in these quite magnificent surroundings. At the Rosenwald Room, named for Lessing Rosenwald. Now, Lessing was, of course, the son of Julius Rosenwald, a founder of Sears, Roebuck and Company, and Lessing followed his father to become chairman of Sears Roebuck in 1932. He was an important collector of rare books and a donor to this very library, as well as a tireless agent for the rescue of European Jews from the clutches of Nazi Europe. And Mark pointed out that the books that we see here today are some of his books. Not all, but some. So may his memory then be for a blessing. I also want to pause and thank a number of other individuals whose work here aided in the writing of my book. Michael Grunberger, then head of the Hebraic section, got me started by tracking down some of the library's harder to find treasures. Later, Peggy Perlstein, who's here, and Sharon Horowitz, who so kindly introduced the talk, helped me locate many books that the library held, but which were not accessible through the general catalogue. Sharon's willingness to find these books and have them waiting for me was much appreciated. And I've already thanked Mark Diminution, the head of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division, for the thrill, and it really is a thrill, to hold and the privilege of photographing some of the rarest and most valuable books that I studied, including the library's beautiful copies of Copernicus's De Revolutionibus and Cellarius's massive atlas that you can see here today. Without the help of each of you, my book would still have been completed, but it would have taken me a great deal longer, and the process would not nearly have been as much fun. You are living treasures within this great library of book treasures. Thank you. Copernicus's model was radical. The Earth, he claimed, was not the unmoving center of the universe, but a planet, or better, one of several planets that orbited the sun. As shown in this highly schematic and visually stunning page from the Atlas, the Earth here shown very much enlarged and depicted 4 times. If you look at the bottom of the illustration, you will see a blindfolded figure on the left representing the ignorance of the Ptolemaic system, which was replaced on the right by the wisdom of the Copernican one. My book tells the story of how Jews responded to the Copernican idea. And after some background in the book, I start with this book. Here is a copy of the first Hebrew text to mention Copernicus, although that accolade depends on your definitions, as we will see. This book, originally called Magen David, the Shield of David, was written sometime before 1612 by David Gans, who was a historian and an astronomer who spent some time in the company of Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, and he printed a few sample copies that he hoped would convince a printer to publish a full-length book. Now, whether Gans' proposal was rejected on commercial grounds or simply ignored following his death in 1613, the work remained unpublished for 130 years until it was rediscovered and edited by Yoel ben Yekutiel Sachs, a rabbi who later became a judge in the rabbinic court of Berlin. Magen David was published by Sachs under a different name. You see it here, Nechmad v'Na'im, beautiful and delightful, although we have no idea why that name was chosen. Incidentally, while this library boasts treasures beyond description, it does not contain a copy of the 1612 précis known as Magen David. To see that, you would have to travel to Oxford, England, where the Bodleian Library houses the only known copy to exist, the Unicom of Magen David. But here is what Gans wrote of Copernicus in his book, shown in the original on the slide for those of you who can read Hebrew in Rashi script. And the first 2 words are the ones of interest. Nicolaus Copernicus. Nicolaus Copernicus, a Prussian, was a very learned man whose fame in astronomy surpassed all his contemporaries. Even today's wise men unanimously admire his sharp intellect and profound understanding of astronomy, and have said that there has not been an astronomer like him since the days of Ptolemy. He has delved deeply into this science, and using his sharp mind, has set his heart on proving that the Earth rotates in perpetual orbit. Incidentally, Gans rejected the Copernican model, which was not unusual for the time. He just said there was simply not enough scientific evidence to support it, and in doing so, he was totally in keeping with the scientific community of the time. So, in the long period in which Magen David remained in manuscript, remember it was finished in 1612, but not printed until 1743, in that long period, another book was published that mentioned Copernicus by name. That work, Sefer Elim by Joseph del Medigo, was published in Amsterdam in 1628. Technically, therefore, Nechnad V'Naim, this book here, was not the first, but rather the second printed book to mention Copernicus, because it lay unprinted for 130 years. There is, however, no doubt that Gans wrote his manuscript before del Medigo published his Sefer Elim, and for this reason it is Gans whom historians acknowledge as having written the first Hebrew work to mention Copernicus. Let's now turn to Joseph del Medigo, who was not only the author of the first widely published Hebrew book to mention Copernicus, he was also a student of none other than Galileo Galilei. Del Medigo, who was born in Crete in 1591, came from a long and distinguished rabbinic family, and a very wealthy family as well, so he spent his entire life studying, supported by his family, and was sent to the University of Padua to study medicine. It was while he was in Padua that he studied with Galileo, who was soon to become famous for both his observations of the planets and his clash with the church. But at the time, Galileo had not publicly declared his support for the Copernican model. Del Medico, pictured here from the second page of his book, Sefer Elim, Del Medigo traveled extensively through Europe, Cairo, Constantinople, and settled in Amsterdam in 1628, where he met and by all accounts befriended the Menashe ben Israel, who had just founded a Hebrew printing press there 2 years earlier. This relationship resulted in the publication of Del Medigo's first work, Sefer Elim, in Amsterdam in 1628-1629. Del Medigo continued to wander, and he settled in Prague, where he died in 1655, and where his tombstone is one of the must-see sites for visitors to the famous old Jewish cemetery there. This picture, as I said, comes to the second page of Sefer Elim. Now, Sefer Elim is a long book. It runs to over 400 pages and deals primarily with philosophy, science, mathematics, and astronomy. Del Medigo admired Copernicus as an outstanding astronomer, as great as Ptolemy himself. In fact, he referred to Copernicus and Ptolemy as the two great radiant lights, playing on the Hebrew from the opening verses of the Bible, which describe the sun and the moon as two great lights. Here is one of the places where he mentions Copernicus. According to Copernicus, the orbit of the planets is easily grasped when we understand that each orbit moves in only one direction, and that all the planets, including the Earth and its elements, move from west to east, like the white and yolk of an egg spinning in its shell. The Earth does not rest in one place, but is carried along in orbit. There is no need to bend the facts in order to fit in with the Aristotelian theory. Rather, the theory should fit the facts if we want the theory to be true. A very radical, scientific and progressive concept for the time, that you don't bend the theory to fit the fact, that you don't bend the facts to fit the theory, but you've bet the theory has to be true, it has to fit in with the facts. Del Medico also unequivocally stated his belief in a universe that is huge and possibly infinite and contains other solar systems, and it is worth noting that it was for this very belief in an infinite universe that, among others, that the Dominican priest Giordano Bruno had been burned at the stake only 28 years earlier. Before leaving the first Jewish Copernican, Del Medico, let's turn to a delicious passage in his book where he calls Galileo his rabbi. My teacher Galileo, the words in Hebrew are shown in the box. Galileo's Rebbe. Galileo's Rebbe. My teacher Galileo observed Mars when it lay close to the Earth. Its light was much brighter than that of Jupiter, even though Mars is much smaller. I requested to look through the telescope, and Mars appeared to me to be elongated rather than round. In contrast, I found Jupiter to be round and Saturn to be egg-shaped. Bless you. So Galileo had a telescope, and Del Medigo, as a student in Padua, was observing the planets through Galileo's telescope. It's remarkable. Now, in my book, I address the question of whether, in fact, it was Galileo who was the source of Del Medico's Copernican conversion. I mean, it seems kind of obvious, right? If you're a student of Galileo and you become a Copernican, so it makes sense that he was your teacher. After bringing the available evidence, I conclude that actually Galileo was not the source of Del Medico's Copernicanism. And I also address a rather outlandish claim made by the French historian André Neher, who wrote the following, and I quote, "When Del Medico published Sefer Elim in 1629, he used the term rabbi in speaking of his teacher Galileo. Rabbi Galileo. Was this not something of a challenge directed to the inquisitors in Rome, who were then preoccupied with Galileo and who were not to let him go until his death in 1642? Free Galileo, Del Medico seems to be saying, or release him to us in the midst of our Jewish community. He will not be subjected to any trial. We shall not require him to make any retraction. We shall welcome him and honor him like a rabbi in Israel." That's the writings of André Neher. Now, that's what Neher wrote, and I showed that this account, unfortunately, is linguistically, historically, and conjecturally flawed. In the first place, although the term used by Del Medico to describe Galileo was indeed the term rabbi, here it means my teacher, not my rabbi. He was not a rabbi. Galileo was a great scholar, but he was, as far as I know, not an ordained rabbi. Secondly, in the years prior to the publication of Sefer Elim in 1629, Galileo had not become the preoccupation of the Inquisition. The work that led to the trial by the Inquisition, the dialogue concerning the two chief systems of the world, was not published until 1632. So Neher's claim that Del Medico was writing a message to release Galileo is chronologically incorrect. And finally, the notion that the Jewish community would not punish one of their own for expressing antinomian views is inaccurate. It was, after all, in Amsterdam itself, the city in which Sefer Elim was published, that the Jewish community excommunicated Spinoza in 1656 on account of, quote, the horrible heresies which he had practiced and taught. So, despite this overstatement of Neher's, there is no doubt that Del Medico not only opened up the world of Galileo and Copernicus to his co-religionists, but also enabled them to study astronomy, mathematics, and machines, and it is not surprising that this work was often cited in later Jewish books on astronomy. So much then for these first mentions of Copernicus. Gans and Del Medico certainly admired the man and his work, even if Gans ultimately rejected Copernicus on scientific grounds. But not every Jew who, like Del Medico, had studied in Padua were as accepting of Copernicus. And this brings us to one of my favorite books here in the library, Maaseh Tuvia, the work of Tuvia, written by Tuvia HaKohen and published in Venice in 1708. Cohen, pictured here, has long been a favorite of historians of science and Judaism, and his book, Maaseh Tuvia, has been called, quote, the best illustrated Hebrew work of the pre-modern era. The book is full of wonderful drawings about astronomy and anatomy, and notice, by the way, how Cohen is depicted here as a man of the world, seated in front of a library, holding a book and a model of the universe known as an armillary sphere. Here is the frontispiece of the book. You can see this is my edition, not the library's edition. And here is probably the best known image of the book, in which the human body is depicted as a house. It's a wonderful image to gaze upon, and you can see how the open windows represent the nostrils, and the kidneys and the bladder are represented by this water-filled fountain, and the heart and the digestive organs are represented by this cauldron boiling away and bubbling away. And it's actually an interesting image, and incidentally, a similar image appears actually in Muslim literature as well, so we can talk about that another time. In any event, Cohen was born in Metz in northeastern France in 1652, and like Del Medico, he studied medicine at the University of Padua. So he studied in the same institute as Del Medico, from where he graduated a little later in 1683. But unlike Del Medico, Cohen rejected the Copernican model, using rather forceful language. Here is the title of the section in which he does that. It reads, Chapter 4, bringing all the claims and proofs used by Copernicus and his supporters showing that the sun is at rest and the earth is mobile, and know how to refute him, for he is the firstborn son of Satan. For those of you who read English, know how to refute him. Ki bachor Satan hu. He, Copernicus, is the firstborn son of Satan. Now, Cohen's rejection was partially on scientific grounds. He goes into some detail in the book about the science. There was all this stuff going on about shooting cannonballs, and they should go further to one direction than another. There was not this concept that we have of inertia. The other scientific experiments that were done involved going to a tall tower and dropping a ball off the tall tower. Now, if the Earth is moving, the ball should not come to rest at the foot of the tower, but some distance from it as the Earth. So there was all this and other scientific evidence that was sort of amassed to support the rejection or the acceptance of the scientific theory of Copernicus, depending on how you said the data came out. But in any event, he rejected it partially on scientific grounds, but mostly because he felt that certain verses in the Bible implied that it was indeed the earth that was immobile and the sun that moved around it. Cohen was not only an important figure as the first Jewish rejection of Copernicus on religious grounds, his work, pictured here for the first time in Hebrew literature, shows the heliocentric model of Nicholas Copernicus. So this is an illustration from Maaseh Tuvia showing for the first time in Hebrew literature what the Copernican system of Nicholas Copernicus looks like, and of course he rejected this. Now, when we pause to consider this illustration, the most striking feature is its simplicity, right? The sun lies at the center and is shown as a large circle of fire. Beyond that are labeled circular orbits of the planets, and the moon is shown orbiting the earth. You can see it there. And in many ways, this illustration is similar to the one that appeared in the book that started it all, Copernicus's De Revolutionibus. And here they are side by side. So in that illustration, in Copernicus's illustration on the left, the sun appeared as a simple circle at the center of the diagram, with the orbits of the planets placed in concentric circles around it without any embellishment. The two images from Copernicus on your left and from Tuvia HaKohen on your right are really similar in their simplicity. And this simplicity should be contrasted with the diagram that accompanied Cohen's text describing the Ptolemaic system, which is the one in which he generally believed, although he actually came to side with Tycho Brahe, but those details are all covered in the book. So here is how Tuvia HaKohen shows the geocentric system. And in this diagram, the Earth doesn't simply occupy the center. If you look carefully, it is detailed with houses set among rolling hills. Furthermore, each orbit contains not just the name of the planet, but also the period of its orbit around the Earth. And finally, in the outermost circle is designated as the sphere of the prime mover, which was part of the Ptolemaic system, even though it contained no stars. Now, Cohen's choice of illustrations surely influences the reader in a subconscious way. The Earth, replete with houses, lies at the center of the Ptolemaic diagram, whereas a fiery ball representing the sun lies at the center of the heliocentric one. Now, Cohen could have chosen to illustrate the Earth in the same way in each of his diagrams. He could have either made them all plain or all with rolling hills, but he didn't do so. And there certainly had been other texts in which the Earth was depicted as inhabitable, yet nevertheless shown orbiting the sun. That Cohen did not illustrate the heliocentric system in this way, I think, was a subconscious effort to make it less attractive than the older Ptolemaic system, and it reminds us to be aware of the way in which authors use their illustrations to further their agendas. Now that we've discussed a reaction to Copernicanism on the European mainland, we turn to London, where an important book was published by Mordechai Leveson, a man who the noted contemporary historian David Ruderman has described as, quote, perhaps the most colorful Jewish intellectual of his times. Leveson, who traveled a great deal and for a short time lived in London, published a book called Ma'amar HaTorah v'HaChachma, an essay on Torah and science, and it was published in London in 1771. It was a digest of contemporary science, and the topics it covered included astronomy, Newtonian physics, and inventions such as the air pump. This book, like nearly all the others I mentioned in this talk, is on display for you here today. Leveson, born around 1740 in Berlin, wrote over a dozen books in Hebrew, English, French, and German on subjects from dogma and Hebrew grammar to sore throats, astronomy, human sexuality, and sometime before 1771, he moved to London where he became a physician. Now, Ma'amar HaTorah v'HaHachma, an essay on the Torah and science, contains some quite revolutionary ideas, and of these, two stand out. The first was that science and religion are two separate domains, and that science could, or rather should, be studied in order to develop a mature religious outlook. And the second idea was that the Copernican model required no more debate or review of any supporting evidence. There was no need to go over the science. It was, quite simply, the only correct model of the solar system. As Leveson told it in his book, the hardships of exile had resulted in the loss of common sense and intellectual prowess in those who studied the Talmud. He wrote, quote, "The Torah and Talmud has fallen into the clutches of men without sense." And he wrote further that these men, and they were all men at that time, these men studied the Talmud in a superficial and what he called an idiotic way, which in turn had a disastrous effect on the fresh minds of young students. Now, as you can imagine, this was all a bit much for the Jews of London in the 1770s. And soon after the publication of this book, Leveson was identified by a London Jew as having been accused of murdering his landlord in Breslau and serving time in prison there while the crime was being investigated. To make matters worse, if they could be worse, the motive for the murder was an alleged affair between Leveson and the wife of the victim. As a result of this revelation, Leveson was expelled from the Duke's Place Synagogue in London, but he was determined to clear his name. In 1775, he published a 4-page rebuttal of the charges. He didn't deny that he'd actually been taken into questioning, but stated that all the boarders of the house where the murder took place had been questioned. In addition, he reprinted a declaration of his innocence that had been signed by the leading rabbis of Berlin. The controversy heated up again when a counter-essay was published later in the same year by an anonymous accuser who echoed the claim that Leveson had an affair with his landlord's wife. Moreover, Leveson was described as a dangerous freethinker who, together with others, was, quote, plotting to abandon, shatter, destroy, and forfeit the religion of our holy Torah. The message to all those who would enter the domain of the science-religion debate could not be more clear. Be careful, for there are some very strong feelings at stake. Let's now turn to a book whose author avoided all such controversy. Baruch Lindau, of whom we know little, was born in Hanover in 1758 and moved to Berlin, where he rose through the ranks of the Haskalah movement, the movement of the Jewish Enlightenment. In 1788, Lindau published a small encyclopedic work called Reshit Limudim, a study primer that covered astronomy, botany, and the animal kingdom and geography. It is therefore not surprising that it addressed the Copernican model of the solar system, but the book had a very different approach to this topic than has been seen so far. Reshit Limudim was written not for adults, but as a textbook for children who were studying the natural sciences in the new modern Jewish schools of the late 18th century. Now, these schools had been founded in Berlin and Frankfurt to replace the traditional yeshiva education and their exclusive study and reliance on traditional Jewish texts by the Maskilim, by the members of the Jewish Enlightenment movement. In Berlin, the Jewish Free School was founded in 1778, and it soon became apparent that there weren't any textbooks for their students to study. Consequently, the Berlin Maskilim set up a printing house that could provide not only a much-needed textbooks, but also a revenue stream to support the philanthropic mission of the school. Those were back in the days, I guess, when you could actually make money from selling books. Lindau published his school textbook, Reshit Limudim, in Berlin. The book became, quote, the most famous up-to-date book on the Hebrew bookshelf at the end of the 18th century, even though, as we mentioned, its primary audience was children. Lindau relied very heavily on a popular contemporary German textbook for children from which he copied large sections, and he began his textbook by explaining that although the sun appears to move through the sky, in reality, this is not the case. We now know, he wrote, that the sun appears to the other planets as a point that is fixed at the center of a circle. Its only movement is about its center, around which it revolves every 22 days. Nevertheless, the sun appears to move through the sky every day as if, but only as if, it is orbiting the Earth. Linda's textbook was a first for Jewish children, and it also began a publishing enterprise that would be repeated as other teachers wrote their own textbooks. I mentioned several of these in my book, and I also describe the plagiarism of this book. In 1789, a year after Reshit Limudim was published, Shimon ben David Oppenheim published a work called Amud HaShachar, The Dawn, in the city of Prague. This brief book was on some of the stories, the Aggadic legends in the Talmud, but quite remarkably, its introduction contained an overview of astronomy plagiarized directly and without any attribution from several pages of Lindau's Reshit Limudim. Now, this is surprising because at the end of the conclusion of the plagiarized section, Oppenheim attacked the Copernican model. And so, of course, he had to be very careful not to copy the bits from Lindau, which were, of course, completely supporting that model. And Lindau said that the heliocentric model had become widely accepted. Now, Oppenheim's work was quickly brought to the attention of Hama'asef, which was a journal of the Maskilim, of the enlightened Jews of Berlin, and they reviewed the plagiarized book in 1790. Let me share some of this review, but I should caution you, for the faint-hearted, that it is not pretty. Here in part is what the review said. So this is the review not of this book, but of Oppenheim's plagiarized book. After reading the book in its entirety, I could not restrain myself for a moment more. I threw this worthless book away in anger and outrage. I have not seen as much nonsense from a group of drunkards or idiots as I have seen written here in this book. However, it was not the plagiarism that seemed to anger the reviewer, but the fact that the author described himself as on the title page as the great one, the Gaon, the great one, sharp and famous, the outstanding investigator Shimon. Here is an image from the front of that book, taken from the collection of the Jewish National Library in Jerusalem, where I examined it. And here are the words that so angered the reviewer, where the author says, this is the book, and I've written by Shimon, the great Gaon, the wise person. Now, according to the reviewer, the matter was brought to the attention of Ezekiel Landau, then the head of the rabbinic court, the Bet Din in Prague, who called the author to his court and forbade him from printing further copies in which he included that description of himself. He said, this is not appropriate. Now, when Oppenheim disobeyed, Landau wrote a public rebuke stating that the book had been published without Landau's permission and that the author was not fitting of the description he wrote of himself, adding, in fact, that he is not fitting of rabbinic ordination in any way. Interestingly, Landau, too, seemed more concerned with the way in which the author had described himself than with the fact that the book contained plagiarized sections, a fact he did not mention in his rebuke of Oppenheim. Now, Oppenheim proceeded undeterred and published a second edition of his plagiarized and anti-Copernican work, although he did remove the plagiarized poems in praise of the book that were actually written by Naftali Hertz-Wessely praising Lindau's book. He thought, I will take these poems and make out as if they're praising my book. He removed those. And this is the version that the Library of Congress owns and is on display here. So here the two versions are shown side by side, and the second printing of the book on your right, the text I've highlighted, was the one that was amended to read, authored by the well-known yeshiva student Shimon, son-in-law of our great and famous Rabbi Leib Oppenheim, head of the rabbinic court. So he tones it down a bit, and in this second edition, or second printing, I should say, which is identical, you can see, other than the change in those words, he changes it a little bit. The author is no longer the great one, sharp and famous, but rather the humble son-in-law of another rabbi. So the Library of Congress catalog should list this book as the second version of the first edition, if it does not do so already. We'll have to check on that. By the way, there is at least one other example of a famous religious figure plagiarizing today what we would call a work of science. In 1572, a French priest named Jean Teisner published a work on magnetism in Cologne under his own name, when in fact the work was a plagiarized copy of the first treatise of magnetism in the Western world, written in the 13th century by Peter Peregrinus. So we share many features with our other religions. And now I want to jump forward a little bit to 1820 to highlight a book called Mosdot Tevel, The Foundations of the World. And in fact, this is the one book that I'm going to mention today that is not on display here, because as far as we can tell, the Library of Congress does not own a copy, although they do have a microfiche of the book, which I used in my research. Now, this book was written by David Friesenhuisen in 1798, but it took him over 20 years to raise the funds needed to publish it. In those days, if you wanted to publish a book, you basically had to go out and get subscriptions. You went from town to town and asked people and said, listen, if I publish this book, will you buy a copy? Once enough people agreed, you went back home, published the book, and went and sold your book. So it took him 20 years to do that. In this work, the author simply assumes that the Copernican model is correct. Although the title page states that the work will outline astronomy according to the Copernican model, this model is neither derived nor supported. Rather, it is treated as an assumption, supported only with a passing and somewhat tangential single scientific fact. The heliocentric model is described as being more elegant than the geocentric one, and with that, the entire question of the movement of the Earth is settled. Here is what Friesenhuisen wrote. If you were to place the Ptolemaic structure of the universe on one side of an intellectual scale and that of Copernicus on the other, and you were to understand the differences between the two systems in detail, you would see that the latter is superior to the former, as gold is superior to copper. The advantage is both in terms of natural laws and in terms of beauty and elegance. Now, although there are several important features of this book that I give, and I give it a special place in the story of how Judaism responded to the Copernican idea, and it also incidentally has what I believe is the only Shabbat Zmirah, the only Sabbath song to be sung at the Sabbath table in praise of the solar system, which I actually have translated and you'll find as an appendix in the book. It's fascinating. The reason I want to bring it to your attention today is because of an article just last week on the front page of the New York Times, last Friday. And no, it's not the story that Twitter will go public. It's the story of the Voyager spacecraft, launched way back in 1977, which, as the Times reported, has now officially left the solar system and has entered interstellar space. Apparently this happened way back in August, but it was reported now. Now, you may remember a famous photo taken by Voyager 1 in 1990 at the suggestion of the astronomer Carl Sagan. Here is that image with the Earth circled for clarity. So this is a picture that Sagan suggested that Voyager 1 should point its camera back towards the Earth as it sped beyond Saturn. So if you were standing on Saturn, this is what the Earth would look like from a telescope. At this distance, the Earth would appear as just a point of light, a pale blue dot. As he wrote in his book, which he called The Pale Blue Dot, Sagan thought that, quote, precisely because of the obscurity of our world thus revealed, such a picture might be worth having. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all the vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. It's all rather dark and bleak, isn't it? And this is why I want to mention Friesenhuisen in his book, Mosdot Tevel, today. You see, Friesenhuisen, writing 2 centuries earlier, had turned this existential fear of insignificance on its head. Although the earth was indeed tiny and seemingly inconsequential, God had chosen to give the Torah to those who inhabit it. This restored the whole of humanity to a place of importance. Although this might save the reader from despair, Friesenhuisen also cautioned against any kind of spiritual arrogance. And he wrote, "How could you believe that the universe was created only for mankind, who live like lowly worms on the surface of this tiny dot?" I mean, the use of the language is just so striking how similar it is. And so Friesenhuisen wrote, there had to be more. And instead of despair, Friesenhuisen suggested joy in the realization that God chose to have a relationship with humanity, with all of humanity, here on this pale blue dot. If only Sagan the atheist and Friesenhuisen the theist could have been here this week to see humanity enter interstellar space, we can only imagine the kind of excitement and debate that would have resulted. Well, time is short, and we must skip over many important books in the story of the Jewish reception of Copernican thought. These include famous work like Spinoza's Tractus Theologico-Politicus, and less known works like Isaac Cardoso's Philosophia Libera, written in Latin and published in Venice in 1673, as well as many of the books published in the 18th and 19th centuries by Jews who weighed in on the science-religion debate in Hebrew and in English and in Yiddish and even in Ladino. Each book is part of this fascinating story and deserves to be mentioned, so to learn more, you may want to pick up a copy of the book, which the library has generously arranged to be sold here today. I want to end, though, by jumping to 1967, the age of the Apollo missions. Now, despite the new space age, some Jews still found it impossible to accept the new astronomy, and it was still called the new astronomy, even though we're 500 years later, the new astronomy of Copernicus, which was by now 400 or 500 years old. And one of the first geocentrists of the space age was Pinchas Waberman, who lived in the 1960s in the ultra-Orthodox enclave of Mea Sha'arim in Jerusalem. And in 1967, Waberman printed a strongly worded attack on the Copernican model in an index to his privately published Sefer HaTechuna, a work written by Chaim Vital, who died in 1620. So he privately republished this book, and here's what he said, and the book is on display here. The title page of Waberman's text left no doubt to his views. Ma'amar Mavo HaShemesh, an essay on the setting of the sun, in which are brought the words of the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, words from Midrash and from the Talmud, against the Copernican system, which stated that the earth orbits among the planets, and that the sun is the center of all the orbits. In this essay, we will very clearly demonstrate in such a way that there can be no objection that his system is a lie and is deceitful, and that it is sacrilegious and heretical. For the truth is that the earth is the center of all that orbits, and this is the position of the Torah and the position of the sages and the position of all the wise Jews of Israel, and it is an eternal truth for all time. Now, you can see the book here on display, and you already know by now enough about the Jewish reception of Copernican thought to realize that Waberman was selectively quoting from only a few works that criticized the Copernican model, and he was ignoring the dozens of works that supported it. As we have seen, there is no truth to Waberman's claim that the geocentric model was the position of all the wise Jews of Israel, although it was certainly the position of some. I analyzed some of the contemporary Jewish geocentrists in the penultimate chapter of my book, including the anti-Copernican views of the late Lubavitcher rabbi, and how they have used Einstein's theory of relativity to prove to their satisfaction that the earth really is the unmoving center of the universe. It's not only fundamentalist-leaning Jews, by the way, who reject Copernicus. I also bring examples from Catholic fundamentalists who do the same. Despite these holdouts, I conclude that when we look back at the historical evidence, there is little doubt that taken as a whole, Judaism in its many contemporary forms has made its peace with what was this most troubling of theories. Judaism's gradual acceptance of the heliocentric theory suggests that although scientific models and accounts of how the natural world works may be viewed with initial hostility or suspicion, they are eventually often accepted and even welcomed. Some chose to accept the model all at once, given the authority of the scientists who supported it, while others rejected the claim because of a lack of experimental evidence and biblical objections as well. But when the experimental evidence became available to support the theory, the biblical objections were reconsidered, while those who held on to the geocentric model maintained that the evidence was faulty or was being incorrectly interpreted. But eventually, even these objections have been shown to be unlikely, and even the most conservative movements within Judaism, with one or two exceptions to be sure, have made peace with the heliocentric model of Nicholas Copernicus. Some 500 years after Copernicus lived, a Jew whose faith is challenged by the notion that the earth revolves around the sun is a rare creature indeed. The suggestion then that all attempts to reconcile faith and science are, in the words of the great atheist critic Christopher Hitchens, consigned to ridicule and failure, is not borne out by the historical evidence that we reviewed. Perhaps religion and science can walk together, if not hand in hand, then certainly side by side. Thank you. If there are questions, I'll be happy to take them. So,
You mentioned that the first book, there's only one copy extant,
yes, that's correct.
right? So, how many copies do you think were made? And if there were more than any, then maybe the second author knew about it.
So it's a good question. So Magen David was the précis that David Gans wrote around 1612, but that was not published. We don't know how many books were made. Only one survived. It's unlikely that the book was in wide circulation, but we simply don't know. There could be other copies, but right now, if you want to see a copy of Magen David, which contains only some of what was published as Nechmat Tanaim, you'll have to go to the Bodleian Library. But we simply don't know. But we do know, for instance, that many of these books were quoted by authors as you go back. It's a great point, and we simply don't know the answer to that.
Because you said it. You said it was the first book, and you said that.
Well, it was the first book that was written.
How could it be the first book? Nobody knew about it. Maybe,
No, we do know. We have a.
maybe nobody knew about it for many, many years.
I think if a book is written and published, that by definition you have the first book. Whether it was widely known, of course, is less likely. Is less likely.
Set up on printing press.
Huh?
It was done with a printing
It was printed. That is correct. Yeah.
So that implies more than
Correct. Correct. Any other points or questions? All right. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to, maybe it's a tangential question, but is it really surprising that that reviewer sort of glossed over the widely plagiarized passages, since plagiarism sort of had, maybe it had that meaning, but that was widely practiced, and it was the norm that you would quote without.
It was the norm, and I should point out that in the review, in the Maha'asef review of Amud HaShachar, he does point out that he notes that it was plagiarized, but he just doesn't make as big a deal of it as he does the part where the author puffs himself up. I didn't mention actually that Amud HaShachar, the plagiarized book, the author, Shimon Oppenheim, was somewhat of a serial offender. 40 years prior to that, he'd published a book called Nezeh HaKodesh, which was a book on ethics, what else, which turned out to be plagiarized from a book published about 200 years earlier. So he was a serial offender. He tended to do this over and over again. Yeah, it's strange but true. But yes, the reviewer notes that the book was plagiarized, but seems to be far more upset with the fact that the author puffs himself up. And I think he was also upset that the book was anti-Copernican, because the enlightened Jews of Berlin took upon themselves, I make this point in the book, for them, Copernicus was a yardstick. Are you with the new or are you with the old? And if you're with the new, you're with Copernicus and the enlightened group. And if you're with the old, you're old school. And so Hama'asef, I think, was critical of Oppenheim, not only for being plagiarizing and not only for puffing himself up as a wise author, but for being on the wrong end of the argument. Mark.
For the Catholic Church, this Copernicus was more than just a scientific theory. It was a huge threat for a variety of reasons, and it's almost woven into theology. Do you have the sense that in Judaism that this is really an intellectual discussion, or are there religious elements that are hooked on to the rejection of Copernicus?
Right, so that's a great point. I didn't have time to get into the complicated question of why some people choose to be on one side of the debate rather than the other. It boils down to a combination of the scientific questions and how you interpret the words of the Bible. So when in the book of Joshua, the sun is commanded to stand still. So if you're a literalist, you say, if Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, the Bible doesn't lie, that must be what happened. And since the sun is told to stand still, it must be moving, and therefore the earth is the center of the universe. So you have this theological question of how you interpret verses. The Catholic Church took its stand, but it was a combination of the science and the Bible. If you were more convinced with the science, well, what you did was you reinterpreted the words of the Bible, and that's actually what Leveson, the Jew who was accused of murder, but in London. But that's what he did. He said the Torah speaks in the language of man, which is an old Talmudic concept, but essentially means the Torah just uses common sense. We today speak of, oh, what a beautiful sunset, but we don't really think that the sun is setting and the earth is, that's how we talk. So he said that it's simply a colloquial use of the term, and don't get hung up about it, the science is more important. But in the book, I spend actually a great deal of time comparing and contrasting the positions of the church with the positions of Jews. And of course, there's one very big difference. The Catholic Church was a unified authority with a structure and a central authority and a system. The Jews throughout Europe had nothing like that. It was sort of the small, localized courts of law. And what I emphasize in the book, time and time again, is that this is not the story of Judaism and Copernicus. This is the story of Jews and Copernicus, and that there was a local reaction that depended on societal factors, that depended on who you were, where you were living, who you were influenced by, where you studied. I mean, surely it's no coincidence the first Jewish Copernican was a student of Galileo's. But where you were, where you studied, and I even show one great example of two students of Khatam Sofer, who was the leading rabbinic figure in Hungary in the 1800s, two students of his taking diametrically opposing positions. Okay, so there were two students of Khatam Sofer, who himself was somewhat of an anti-Copernican. One said, you can't possibly believe in the theory, and the other was saying, and they only lived about 50 miles from each other. The other was saying, no, the theory makes absolute sense, and Jews need to stay out of the university. The university and the house of study are two separate areas. So there was a lot of sort of local factors that were at play, and I think what's important, at least from my take-home message, is that the story is one of how Jews reacted to Copernicanism, not how Judaism, which is different to the Catholic story in some ways. So.
This has absolutely nothing to do with Copernicus, but in the early 1970s, I was a secretary for a Columbia University faculty seminar, interdisciplinary seminar on the nature of man, if you will. And I.I. Rabi was one of the members, the great Jewish physicist who was part of the Oppenheim project, etc. And I forgot what the subject of that particular seminar was, but he stood up and he said, science has taken us as far as we can go. All else is God now.
And he said that in the 70s.
This was the 70s, and this is one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century.
Well, it's the question of scientism and religion is really a fascinating one. It's a little bit beyond our topic today, though. It is certainly one that interests me. I don't think science has taken us where we need to go, as far as we can go. We have a long way to go, and we're still only beginning that journey to understand the universe. Whether all is explained by science and there's nothing else, you may have seen a recent debate on the pages of the New Republic between Steven Pinker, who wrote a very interesting piece begging the humanities to take more science on board, and a wonderful and somewhat acerbic response by Leon Wieseltier here in the Washington area, who attacked Pinker for suggesting that that the arts owe something to science, and they're two quite separate fields, and that you're somewhat of a cultural Philistine for thinking otherwise. It's a wonderful debate. I think it really points to what you're getting at, is this humanities versus science debate. I don't think it needs to be a versus. I think they could be combined, and my opinion is that they both contribute in very meaningful ways. But you're right to point out, even back then it was.
He was also in his late 70s, so I mean, as someone who's getting old also.
So I think we'll wrap it. Could we please thank our speaker again?
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.